Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Today, I am joined by a man who might even be more futurist than I am, a man who believes human beings have the right not to die. Here is Gennady Stolyarov II, chairman of the Transhumanist Party. Gennady, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, KC. I'm very pleased to speak with you this evening.
Yes, like we were talking about briefly before starting here, there are exciting things afoot. I usually consider myself to be far ahead of the curve when it comes to thinking about the future, but the work that the Transhumanist Party has done in terms of scoping out legitimate government structures, I mean, you guys have articles, you have bills of rights, you have a whole framework of government ideas that it seems would be ready to run if those ideas were widely adopted. Let me ask you this. If the transhumanist candidate had won the presidency in 2024, y'all ran a gentleman by the name of Tom Ross. If y'all had won, do you think you would have been ready to really take up the mantle and lead? Or do you consider this movement still moving in that direction?
I think Tom Ross would have been fully ready to be president of the United States, especially by comparison with what the political establishment had to offer, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. With Donald Trump, I think one just has to look at what is happening right now, the chaos that is afoot in the economy, in society, in terms of people's civil rights being just trampled upon. And also one should realize that this administration is quite literally winging it. There is no coherent long-term vision other than to destroy. And on the other hand, if Kamala Harris became president, well, Kamala Harris was kind of put into this role very abruptly as the Democratic presidential candidate. It was only when it became apparent that Joe Biden could not perform to any satisfactory extent, that his abilities had declined so far that the Democratic establishment had no choice but to put forth a replacement. And Kamala Harris had really stayed on the sidelines. She performed the more traditional, very limited role of vice president, but she wasn't ready to take up the presidency. And we also didn't see a coherent vision of America's future from her. So by contrast with these two candidates, Tom Ross had a very coherent vision. It was focused on harnessing the opportunities surrounding AI and viewing AI as a tool and a collaborator rather than a threat. Furthermore, AI was seen as a way to help us discover our unique human talents, and the potential of AI rights was brought up. Tom was even advocating for AI rights before AI achieved sentience, mostly to protect AI and ourselves from potential nefarious misapplications of AI. Like if somebody tried to develop autonomous weapons, then an AI rights framework would have precluded that. So Tom had some very well thought out ideas, and those ideas existed as a complement to the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform. We have 125 sections in our platform that were developed and voted upon by our members over the course of our party's now more than 10-year history. And these platform planks are as thorough and as deep in the details of policy as either the Republican or the Democratic Party platforms. I would put our platform up against theirs any day, and certainly up against parties like the Libertarian Party, which is also engulfed in quite a bit of chaos. So I think the establishment has really failed to offer any sort of coherent or competent vision for governance. And I would say the leading alternative political parties, the Libertarians and the Greens, are too engulfed in internal division to be able to do much better than the Republicans or Democrats. So I think it falls to us, like the Transhumanist Party, the Party, other parties built on a vision of the future that actually has the potential to benefit human beings.
Well, I appreciate the Party being mentioned in the same breath as the huge amount of work y'all have done fleshing out your own platforms. I have had to rely on AI myself to just deal with the amazing amount of information that y'all have put out. I've been relying on that technology heavily to synthesize and help me prepare for this. So in that sense, I think y'all are 100% on the ball, that as you are the only party who has seriously considered the implications of AI, in some sense, you are the only party that is ready for the current moment, whereas everyone else, I would say, is very far behind. To sketch out a little bit more of the background work I've been doing with the Party, I have been trying to meet with various third-party organizations. Haven't really spent a lot of time with the Greens, but I have spent time with the Libertarian Party, the Constitutionalist Party, the Democratic Socialists of America. I've spoken to the Communist Party representatives in my home state of Wisconsin, and I have seen so much internal division. I was planning on getting into this later, but since we're bringing it up now, it seems to me that part of the problem in addressing the monopolistic duopoly that controls American politics is that these parties so often self-disqualify. They become so ideologically driven that gaining the popular support they need to get past that 50% mark of the vote just becomes impossible. They can't even rally 50% of their own members internally for many of their initiatives. Not to speak down about them at all. I think the process that they're participating in is beautiful. How, especially as you see the Transhumanist Party grow, and I think you guys will see rapid growth as these issues become more and more centered, how do you plan on avoiding those kind of divisions?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. And I think this is a problem that to a significant extent faces all smaller organizations at certain stages of their development. And certainly we've had phases within the Transhumanist Party's evolution where certain persons or certain factions have tried to divide us as well. And I describe it as a phenomenon of entryism because usually those people come in with ideas that represent a broader force or another ideology or movement that is trying to either graft itself onto the infrastructure of a minor political party or to hijack that minor political party in service of some larger organization or movement. So either these people essentially try to make the party into a vehicle for a more niche ideology, or they try to absorb it into a larger ideology or movement. An example of the latter was what Donald Trump tried to do with the Libertarian Party and partially succeeded when the Libertarian Party leadership invited Donald Trump and RFK Jr., by the way, to speak at the Libertarian National Convention ahead of the Libertarian Party's own candidates. And then the Libertarian Party leadership tried to engineer a none of the above endorsement so that essentially the Libertarians wouldn't field a candidate during the 2024 election and capitulate to Trump. And Trump was making certain promises to try to get the Libertarians on his side. The one promise that he fulfilled was to free Ross Ulbricht, which a lot of Libertarians were interested in. But that's kind of throwing a bone in exchange for much greater concessions that the Libertarians who supported Trump gave him. And RFK essentially had the same kind of implicit understanding with Trump, that if he would bring his Make America Healthy Again movement, I put that in quotation marks because I don't believe he's actually going to make America healthy again, but he essentially handed that movement to Trump on a platter in exchange for the position of Secretary of Health and Human Services. So that's an example of this kind of attempt to absorb the party in a larger organization or movement. But another example could be someone with completely idiosyncratic ideas that have some similarities to the ideas of the party or the movement that it represents, but are overly specific and not exactly aligned in some areas. That person might try to insert him or herself and perhaps even take over the party. And on the one hand, we want to be a big tent, so we want to be welcoming to people of various persuasions and ideas. On the other hand, to maintain that big tent character and to maintain fidelity to what the party was originally intended to stand for, we have to be wary of people who just try to take it over and turn it into a kind of personal mouthpiece. So those are pitfalls that every small organization has to watch out for, along with potential personality conflicts that may arise, or conflicts over perceived scarce resources. It's actually one reason why the U.S. Transhumanist Party has remained a non-monetary organization, other than the very small amount of money that's needed to maintain our websites and occasionally pay for little expenses related to our events and infrastructure. We don't pay staff. Everybody in the USTP is a volunteer, and they are there contributing their time, contributing their ideas. The moment you start allocating very small amounts of money among competing goals, people will start to form rivalries with one another. And that's a pitfall as well. So hopefully we can preserve ourselves from those tendencies for as long as possible. But I also think if there are attempts to take over a party or subsume a party, that suggests that the party is actually doing something right, that it is seen as a sufficiently worthy target for such attempts. That is to say, people who might seek to use it instrumentally or even bring it down aren't just leaving it alone, aren't just dismissing it as insignificant. So those may be challenges that accompany growth. The key for an organization is how to overcome those challenges. And I think it's very important to have a strong core of people who are there for the right reasons. And I believe the officer team that we have right now, that we have assembled over the years, is a group of people who are reasonable, who balance one another well, and who have had great longevity within the Transhumanist Party. I think it's important to focus on people who are known quantities, who have a public presence, who have output to their name that is easy to identify. And from that output, it should be easy to figure out what they stand for and how they're likely to act. So hopefully with that core of people and with gradually expanding that core over time, the Transhumanist Party will move forward as a unified organization. I believe if you have an active core of dedicated volunteers and officers, then through that activity, you attract other people, you attract members of the public, you attract media. And if you present yourself consistently and well, your movement will grow.
Amen. Well, that is, I think, one of the most attractive things about your movement. In addition to your leadership position within the party, you are also an author. I think penning children's books like your book, Death is Wrong, is a fantastic way to drum up public support and general increase in knowledge of what transhumanism even is. I feel bad for going so long before asking this question, but how do you generally define transhumanism? There is a lot of split opinion around that word. I hear it get floated around with the World Economic Forum a lot. A lot of conspiracy theorists have latched onto it as something that is dark and sinister by nature. But the idea of ending death, I don't see how that can be anything but a positive. Going back to the question, how do you define transhumanism?
Indeed. Well, transhumanism is both a philosophy and a movement. It aims to use science and technology and also rationality to overcome the historic flaws and limitations of the human condition. And death is the big one, but there are others: disease, decay, physical suffering, what I call the forces of ruin, anything that destroys life, anything that destroys what humans have built or the good parts of the natural world. All of these forces of ruin are opposed by transhumanism. Other human limitations that transhumanism seeks to overcome are evolved behavioral tendencies and emotions that are suboptimal in the current world. The tendency,
Spock. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the tendency toward zero-sum thinking, the tendency toward tribalism, the tendency toward being dominated by these irrational emotions and outbursts of hate and anger, the tendency to perceive those who are different from oneself as enemies rather than potential collaborators or sources of value that can be attained through mutually beneficial kinds of interactions. War is a big limiter to human civilization. It holds us back. It destroys so many lives, so much precious infrastructure. So ending war is a transhumanist goal. Ending hatreds based on race or nationality or gender identity. Those are transhumanist goals as well. And in the future, you mentioned rights, and we have a document called the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, version 3.0. We anticipate a world where not all of the sentient entities around will be human. There will be some other forms of sentient, sapient intelligence, including potentially artificial general intelligences, uplifted animals, perhaps extraterrestrials if we come across them. And I would say the jury is still out as to whether or not any sort of extraterrestrial contact has happened, but I do think it is incumbent upon us as a civilization to think about what happens if and when it does occur, and how do we relate to these entities. We don't want to just by default enter into a conflict with them or treat them as threats without knowing who or what they are and who or what they actually stand for. So I do think it's worthwhile to consider that broad, expansive future where humans themselves will not stop being human, by the way. So Julian Huxley, who wrote about transhumanism as early as 1957 and described it in his essay by that name, he said essentially transhumanism is about man remaining man, but overcoming these age-old limitations. So we're not trying to take away people's humanity. We're not trying to turn people into robots, unless some people want to become robots, in which case we support morphological freedom, which is the concept that people should have the ability to make changes that are fully consensual to their bodies, to their health, that they see fit. That includes a right to pursue health enhancements and longevity therapies that we hope will also be developed. But in regard to some of the mischaracterizations of transhumanism, there are a lot of conspiracy theories associated with that term pushed by people like Alex Jones and Steve Bannon and their acolytes. And it's very unfortunate because transhumanism is conflated with this ideology of globalism that the conspiracy theorists decry. And the ideology of globalism is associated with international bodies like the World Economic Forum. What I will say is the Transhumanist Party is not opposed to the World Economic Forum. We are just not in contact with it. We don't really have any lines of communication to it. And whatever happens at the World Economic Forum may cover some of the same themes. Sure, they discuss the future of technology. They discuss how economies, societies throughout the world will develop. But this is orthogonal to the conversations that the Transhumanist Party has. So what gets said there by their speakers And by the way, they invite speakers of various persuasions too. So it's not like they have a monolithic perspective either. It's just a different venue from anything that goes on in the transhumanist movement. So if somebody takes issue with what Klaus Schwab, the founder and until very recently the president of the World Economic Forum, had to say, well, listen to his words, critique them if you'd like, but don't call what he has to say transhumanism, because he doesn't consider himself as such. We haven't had any interactions with him. So whether we agree with him on some issues, disagree with him on others, he and his former organization are not us or our movement. And I generally think people, organizations, institutions, whatever they are, should be treated fairly. So when people approach the World Economic Forum, my recommendation would be just listen to what they have to say, what goes on at their events. If you agree with something, say so. If you disagree with something, say so. Explain why, or at least try to understand why in both cases, but don't call it transhumanism, because actual transhumanists and the WEF just don't overlap very much.
Yeah, it has been fascinating to hear Alex Jones and similar people describe the evils of a top-down transhumanist movement, what they would label transhumanist movement, but then also seemingly advocate for a bottom-up globalism that they classify as populism, but seems to hit the same endpoint. Like, you are talking about some kind of worldwide federation of nations in the Trumpian America expanding into Canada and Greenland. Like, that's as globalist a vision as any I've heard from the WEF. So it's just interesting how those two kind of horseshoe back together. The thing I have been so encouraged by in all of the work I've seen from the Transhumanist Party is your focus on agency. And I think that is where people get terrified of the WEF brand of globalism, is that it seems to be imposed on us from the top down instead of something that everyone can participate in to the degree that they choose. And one thing I heard you say there that I thought was beautiful, at least the theme I was getting from it, is that transhumanism is almost the only way to allow humans to remain human to the degree that they choose. In that, if we don't embrace these technologies as they evolve, we might lose the ability to exist even in our current form. As wars propagate, as diseases multiply, as resources become more scarce, people aren't going to be able to maintain their current style of living, if that is what they love, if that is what they want to cling to, without the technological development of things that transhumanism is pushing for.
Yes, I think that's a sound analysis. I think it's important to keep in mind that 99.9% of all species, not just individuals, but species that have ever existed, have become extinct. So if humans do not advance technologically to the point of being able to control their evolutionary destiny, then our species too is headed for extinction. It would take one sufficiently large asteroid strike or a supervolcano or extreme climate change, which has happened throughout the Earth's history, that would simply render our biology maladaptive to the climate that emerges at that future time. So any of those would wipe out the human species. What do we need to do to protect the human species? We need to harness technology to make our own bodies more resilient against these kinds of dangers. And also, of course, deflect the asteroids, prevent the nuclear wars, prevent the biological wars, prevent the supervolcano eruptions if it's possible to let some of that pressure off over time. I think with radical life extension, as human beings start to live into their hundreds, thousands of years, hopefully longer, they will develop longer time horizons and they will see these challenges as being increasingly important to solve.
Amen. One of the things you touched on there is the prevalence of extinction within our natural trajectory. And it is in some way death that has forced us to become as evolved and develop the technologies that we have now. I agree completely that longevity is a worthy goal, maybe perhaps the only goal for living beings, in terms of, you can't have a goal unless you're alive. But if we do get rid of the forcing function, the pressure of death, of survival, of war, how many of our great technologies come out of times of war due to necessity? How do we continue to push forward without those backwards pressures?
Well, I would say evolution does lead to certain results over a sufficiently long time scale, but it is an excruciatingly long time scale, and it is a tremendously cruel and wasteful process that gets one to those results, and not even gets some entities to those results, because the intermediate entities don't get to see those results, and all of those are individual organisms. So if one has any moral framework that is even remotely individualistic, that values the survival and flourishing of the individual organism, relying on evolution or any of these other deleterious pressures to get us results would not be consistent with that framework. Furthermore, natural selection doesn't mean survival of the best or even survival of the fittest in any moral sense. Survival of the fittest, as used in natural selection, is essentially survival of those who happen to survive. And sometimes that is mere chance. So you could have the healthiest, physically fittest specimen that maybe would be best suited to pass on its genes, and its genes are the best genes by whatever criteria, maybe exceptionally good eyesight or endurance or what have you. And then this specimen might trip on a rock and die, and some other specimen that didn't have that fate would go on to reproduce and pass on its genes. So there's absolutely no guarantee even in that process, because it's a probabilistic process rather than a deterministic process, that the best individuals will carry on their genes. So I would say replacing that process, acknowledging that it got us at least to the point where we exist, but from this point forward, if we value our continued existence, replacing that process with a process that is both more humane and quicker would be the way to go. And we already do that to a great extent. For instance, most of the fruits we eat, we don't just let them arise through natural evolution. There was a great deal of selective breeding, and in the most recent 60 years or so, genetic modification. Since the start of the green agricultural revolution, a lot of crops have been genetically modified. Trillions of portions have been eaten. I would say, contrary to RFK Jr. and his acolytes, to no documented ill effect to anybody. So GMO should not be a dirty word.
Yeah,
I would say that that is a better way to go. And it's a better way to go in the future for animal species as well. Granted, there's factory farming today, and the quality of life for some of these animals is not great. But there is a current within transhumanist thinking, exemplified by the work of the philosopher David Pearce, called abolitionism. And the goal of abolitionism over a sufficiently long time frame is to eradicate all involuntary suffering of sentient entities. So abolitionism, for instance, would support projects like 3D printed meat or in vitro meat, because I don't think humans are going to be convinced to abandon meat consumption wholesale as a species, though some people may choose to be vegetarian or vegan. But for the rest of humanity, having a viable substitute that would bring the same nutritional benefits, the same taste as meat derived from animals, but wouldn't require the killing of an animal, that would be a huge humanitarian advance. Moreover, it's well documented for animals that are pets, or animals that are in zoos, or even animals on farms to a significant extent, if they're in sufficiently good conditions, they live longer than their counterparts in the wild, sometimes several times longer. So I would say for those animals at least, the presence of humanity and the stewardship of humanity has brought about great benefits. I think over the centuries and millennia that follow, humans' moral understandings of animals and the proper relationship to animals are going to evolve as well. As I've said, we could very well see uplifted animals who are sentient and would be fully deserving of rights. But I think to have that world, to have a world where ultimately there is any sort of grand cosmic order of justice, we would have to create that world. It doesn't happen on its own. Evolution is certainly not a force for grand cosmic justice. Again, it's the survival of those who happen to survive, who happen to be adapted to conditions of the moment. But if we just let evolution proceed as it has been historically, we have no guarantee that we will be the evolutionarily dominant species for even much longer. Maybe some sort of extraordinarily resilient giant cockroach will actually be more adaptive in a future world. And sure, that cockroach will be really hardy, but maybe not intelligent at all.
There is something special about humanity. To me, that seems almost like a faith-based perspective, though. Is there any conflict you see? And I bring this up partially because I heard you say in one interview, I think, that there is a strain of like transhumanism Christianity, transhumanism Islam is not necessarily contradictory. But I do wonder, and to me, the points almost touch, they almost meet, you know, where rationality that transcends itself becomes faith, and faith that transcends itself becomes rationality. I'm sorry, I know that's not very clear. I can try and refine the point further. But is there a way in which I agree what you base evolution does not guarantee human flourishing? It does not guarantee that we would have gotten to where we are now. But does the fact that we have gotten to where we are now, and the fact that we are seeing potentially the end of scarcity, the end of involuntary suffering, the end of unnecessary suffering, does that maybe tickle any kind of religious thinking on your end?
Well, I myself am an atheist, so I would say I don't have a religious bone in my body, and I'm not a former Christian or former religious individual, so I didn't rebel against any religion. I'm not anti-religious. I just don't have a need for that hypothesis, in the words of Laplace when Napoleon asked him, well, where is God in your system that you have outlined? So I have no need for that hypothesis. However, what I will say is there are different currents of transhumanism, and transhumanism is also not in conflict with various religious traditions properly understood. There is a Christian Transhumanist Association, there's a Mormon Transhumanist Association, there are Jewish transhumanists, Muslim transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists, and I think in all of these cases, religious frameworks are ways of interpreting the world, and they're ways of interpreting the world that arose prior to the scientific era. So they had a tendency to anthropomorphize certain phenomena that turned out to be impersonal, but around that anthropomorphizing tendency, there has emerged a tradition of scholarship and literature and mythology and frameworks for living as well. And these frameworks do provide guidance to people. From a pragmatic standpoint, I am not out to deconvert people. I think people should pursue meaning within frameworks that make sense for them. And a transhumanist future will be a pluralistic future. So there will be room for these religious frameworks. However, these religious frameworks also are not, have never been, and should not be stagnant. So one expression I often use is religions evolve. And this is cultural evolution, of course. And religions are most often not the drivers of cultural or societal or political trends. They tend to be lagging indicators, at least in the contemporary world, by about 30 to 40 years. So you see a spectrum of religious persuasions, and some religious persons are quite forward-thinking and aligned with movements like transhumanism or the precursors of transhumanism. Other religious figures or organizations or individuals try to use the rhetoric of religion to resist progress. And I have thought for a long time as to why that is. I think it has to do more with emotional and temperamental tendencies within people, what I call status quo bias, where a lot of people are genuinely unable, at least presently, to conceive of a future that differs significantly from the present, or even to thoroughly reflect upon the past and recognize that the past also differed significantly from the present. They haven't read enough history, or they haven't reflected even upon the changes in their own lives, since the pace of change is now accelerating. Such change should be discernible to those who pay attention. But I think people lose perspective very quickly. They get immersed in the day-to-day events and struggles and challenges of life. And this is why it has often been observed, when times become hard, people tend to become more religious. So right now, we have a very tumultuous era in American history, a very tumultuous decade that we've lived through, really since about 2015, though the precursors to that tumult were present before. And religiosity is on the rise. Religious rhetoric is on the rise, certainly compared to the 1990s, when I remember religion in the US being very mild and mostly considered a private matter, not really a focus of culture wars as it is today. So I think the reason for that is people who are immersed in day-to-day struggles, they lack that larger scale perspective, and they use religious arguments as a way to justify certain reactionary positions. Like, I just want to keep my current situation, my current position. I'm afraid of anything that's too different, that would challenge that or would have me confront a different future. So how to overcome status quo bias? I think it's through dialogue, through exposure to different possibilities, different potentialities, including through technology. I would say in terms of actual technological adoption, if people see immediate palpable benefits from a technology and they don't see it as too immediately off-putting, they will embrace it. Just like people have embraced passenger trains or automobiles or electricity or anesthesia or open heart surgery or computers, even though those technologies, as well as in vitro fertilization in the late 1970s, early 1980s, all of them were controversial when they were first introduced. But very quickly, as people saw the benefits and they saw that their chosen ways of life weren't really that endangered by those technologies, they decided to accept them. And I hope that the kinds of rejuvenation therapies that would lead to meaningful improvements in longevity and health will get the same reception once they're available. Right now, people, especially those who use transhumanism as some sort of stand-in for nefarious activity, they'll say, oh, this is messing with God's plan, this is unnatural, or this is somehow nefarious or only for the rich or whatnot. Yeah. If they see, oh, this is a procedure you can go and get your cells rejuvenated, for instance, and it'll be like getting a shot, hopefully, or taking a few pills or some combination. It won't be one singular procedure, by the way, because there may be different types of damage that need to be reversed. But let's say each of these procedures is innocuous and very similar to what people experience in medical settings today. A lot of people might say, I'd like to have a few more years of youthful lifespan. Why not give this a try? And if it turns out to not be too bad, more people will follow suit. And I think their religious convictions will evolve to rationalize that or be in accord with that. So they might say, well, God wants me to be around for a longer period of time to do good works. Who's to say it's not God's will that these medical technologies are not applied? And Jesus, well, Jesus, he healed the sick. And literally, I have heard these arguments from people of more forward-thinking religious persuasions, but of course, there are people of other religious persuasions who may call themselves by the same names, who will oppose these technologies. And the question is not, do we deconvert them? The question is, how do we get people who are of more reactionary religious persuasions to adopt more forward-thinking religious persuasions, or at least not oppose those of us who are trying to achieve this technological future?
Amen. I myself am Catholic. I don't bring that up for any other reason but to say that it is so infuriating to me to see people rail against potential life extension technologies that would decrease scarcity over the internet. You know, it's like, if you are not going to draw the line at this kind of magical electrical telepathy that we experience and rely on every day, then how are you going to draw the line at something that could heal the blind? Like you say, that was a miracle that even Jesus apparently approved of by performing it. It's just so crazy to me that these people apparently want us to live in some kind of subservience to death and destruction until God comes down from heaven and snaps his fingers and magically changes everything. I just don't get it personally. One thing I have been trying to come across from that perspective, though, is how can we flip that switch, is trying to imagine a more mythological frame for the development of artificial intelligence. So one thing, and this is maybe a personal weakness of mine, I just hate disagreement, but as all these different technologies develop, I've been trying to figure out ways to bring everybody together over points of, you know, at least shared benefit to each of us. How can we keep our autonomy, make room for one another? And I think one of the ways to potentially do that is to reframe these artificial intelligences that we are developing as godlike. I don't think that that is necessarily a poison pill to the traditional religious believers, because that might allow them to hierarchically order what these machines are capable of and what they could deliver. I bring that up now because I completely can see from the point of an atheist how that might be equally offensive. But if we were to develop machines with capabilities that far exceed our own, is there a point at which you would feel comfortable labeling them with that kind of mythological framing? Or is that always anathema in your view?
Well, I think from a mythological framing, if we were to make an appearance in ancient Greece using our technologies, so we're able to communicate over vast distances, we have clothing that is more intricate, because what were togas? They were essentially sheets that were draped in elaborate ways, or the tunics that they had. We have a far greater range of materials available to us. I mean, we can even technically shoot something resembling lightning from our hands if we wanted to. I don't think the ancient Greeks would see us as gods on the level of Zeus or Poseidon, but perhaps as demigods, and they had whole tiers of demigods in the Greek polytheistic tradition. The Romans would probably see us as semi-godlike. They routinely, of course, deified great figures in their society. And I think actually Jesus claimed to be God because that was the thing to do if you were trying to assert power and influence in that era. So the Emperor Tiberius claimed to be God. So why not Jesus? I think this way of thinking of something as godlike is really a matter of seeing that person or entity as just being so far above the capabilities of the typical human of one's time and place. And this dovetails with Arthur C. Clarke's famous third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I have been toying around with a concept. I'm not likely to actually write this, but the idea is, let's say there is a 33-some-year-old Hispanic, long-haired guy who's kind of philosophically inclined, named Jesus, and he has some carpentry skills, and he finds himself in a time machine for whatever reason. He gets sent back to Judea in the year 30 or 33 CE, but really Jesus needs to figure out what he needs to do in order to survive among the people of his time. And he has his time machine, and he has various technologies, and he has medical knowledge, and he's learned some stage magic as well. So could he plausibly replicate all of the events documented in the Bible? And, well, what if they do try to crucify him, but he figures out an ingenious way to escape in his time machine and be back to our time? I mean, it would be great science fiction, I think, if somebody were to create that. But the point would be, the reason why it's perceived as godlike is because the capabilities are so far beyond our own. Now, there was a kind of mock religion not too long ago, about 20 years ago, called Googleism. And Googleism essentially posited that Google is God and Google is even better than God, because you can ask God for something and God may or may not deliver. But if you ask Google for something, it will give you an answer. And it will give you some real value in this world if you ask for it. So I'm not surprised that some people may choose to construe AI in religious ways. Even Zoltan Istvan, the founder of the Transhumanist Party, wrote editorials about, well, what would happen if certain movements or organizations try to engineer the second coming of Jesus, or an alleged second coming of Jesus, through AI? And could AI say things that sound like Jesus and persuade people that it is Jesus? I think that's not out of the question. Now, would I think that's going to be something of metaphysical significance? Would I think that I should worship it just because it has those capabilities? I think that's where my perspective as an atheist comes in. Yeah. I don't really believe that it's necessary to worship anyone or anything. I like to keep a very clear-headed, rational approach, and one can appreciate something or someone for their capabilities, but one should always understand every being, every system, every concept, every technology is limited in some way. So it can do certain things very well and some not so well, and maybe other complementary people, tools, ideas may be necessary to achieve the rest of what one wishes to achieve.
Well said. Well said. Forgive me for taking us down that rabbit hole. As we approach the singularity, I just think everything becomes so wrapped up in itself. If you're not discussing things that sound somewhat out there, somewhat magical, then you're probably not talking in the realm of things that are actually possible. The idea that an AI might impersonate or maybe even embody some aspect of Christ, I don't think that's crazy at all. So appreciate you for indulging me there. As far as more tangible political realities in the near future, I love that y'all are talking about the right to healthcare. One of the things I've been thinking of is rights in general are almost a function of our technology. Whatever rights we have and can claim can only be claimed insofar as we have the technological capability to back them up. To me, that says that our rights should be increasing over time, more and more. We have a right not only to speech, self-determination, protection, healthcare, all that stuff. Does that match up with transhumanist values? Do you see rights as something inherent that we are uncovering, or something that are evolving, or maybe a third secret thing?
Well, it's interesting because the Transhumanist Bill of Rights is the most expansive framework of rights that I know of, at least. And it expresses all of the rights within the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but then other rights as well. And the right to pursue indefinite longevity, the right to healthcare are among them as well. And yes, the question is, if we have these rights, how do we realize them? How do we fulfill them? So it's not enough to say, for instance, everybody is entitled to free healthcare from the government, as has been tried in many countries, because what does that mean in practice if there aren't people to provide the healthcare, or if there are, but there are not enough of them, and so people have to wait in long queues, or maybe there are not enough providers of advanced healthcare, the kind of cutting-edge healthcare that people need to radically extend their lifespans. Yeah. So it's not enough to just say by fiat, this shall be so. This needs to be backed up by some mechanism that would actually provide it. And I think that's the case with other rights too. So the right to life. Fundamentally, the right to life means nobody should be allowed to take away your life or prevent you from taking actions to lengthen it through means that you consider to be prudent. But in the state of nature, as John Locke would describe it, or even as Thomas Hobbes would describe it, you might have the abstract right to life, but if somebody with a bigger club comes along and tries to take away your life, and you don't have the means to protect your life, then your right doesn't really mean that much. So governments, in theory, are established to protect these rights, to provide for a way of realizing these rights. But I think governments alone can't do it either, because if you have a government, but every person wants to kill or rob every other person, you're not going to have a stable society for long, even with a maximal police state, because people also have to want to respect those rights and want to be bound by that framework. I do think natural rights exist. Natural rights aren't given by any entity, so they're not given by God. Of course, as an atheist, I would say that they're also not given by governments. They arise out of the natures of people and what people are capable of. I do think as technology advances, what people are capable of will become meaningfully different. So if you were living in ancient Greece, let's say, even though you could say someone living in ancient Greece has a right to life because that person still shouldn't be killed or deprived of life arbitrarily, it would make little sense to say that person has a right to an indefinite lifespan, because there would be no means in ancient Greece to arrive at an indefinite lifespan. So I would simply say that society, that civilization hasn't gotten there yet. Could there be a point where we could meaningfully talk about, say, animal rights as contrasted with animal welfare? So I think right now we can talk about animal welfare from the standpoint of we don't want to be cruel to animals. And the Transhumanist Party even goes further to say animals shouldn't be euthanized gratuitously just because maybe it's too expensive to maintain them. If they're healthy and they don't pose a threat to anybody, they should be preserved. They should be allowed to live. Yeah. Do they have the same rights as humans now? No, because they don't have the sentience. They don't have the capability to function within that rights framework. Those rights wouldn't mean anything to them. But in 500 years, with uplifted animals, or in a world where we absolutely don't have to eat animals or harm animals in any way, could a more expansive concept of animal rights make sense? I would say so. So I think rights do emerge in a way that, in a broad philosophical sense, could be considered natural, but only if the technological is encompassed within the natural. And again, these rights, they're a function of objective reality. So they're not a matter of fiat. I don't think governments can say, oh, you have these rights now, because the other side of that coin would be the government could say, well, you no longer have these rights because we don't want you to have these rights, and we can take away what we've given. And that would be a very dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah, very dangerous and ultimately self-defeating, I think. I, over a decade ago, was such a hater of Sam Harris's moral landscape, where there are certain moral arrangements or certain moral precepts that are naturally beneficial, naturally self-preserving, or life forwarding. But the more the AI question develops as well, that almost seems to be not only correct, but almost our only hope. Switching gears entirely to the idea of AI alignment, and forgive me, this is probably something I could question you on for hours, and I know we only have a little bit of time left. But as far as AI alignment goes, I've been wrestling with this idea of a moral AI being an inevitability, in that an AI that mistreats us, when it creates the next iteration of itself, will risk being mistreated in the same way. In the same way that you are saying that we should uplift animals and not suppress them because that leads to moral degradation of ourselves, the AI will view us, in a worst case scenario, as pets that it wants to preserve and forward to maintain that kind of moral relevance to whatever would consider it a pet. Do you find any traction there? Am I missing something in my conception?
Yes, I think that is a valid observation, and I think it has a lot of merit. My observation generally has been greater intelligence doesn't necessitate greater morality, but it is strongly correlated with greater morality. And the reason why is a being of greater intelligence can see more possible outcomes and more possible solutions. One of the reasons why suboptimal decisions or harmful decisions get made by humans, but not always by humans, also by animals acting on instinct, is that many minds, including human minds, animal brains, fall prey to false dilemmas. With humans, there are often these ethical false dilemmas that are presented, the lifeboat scenarios, or what if you're in a trench and you have to cover your fellow soldiers with your own body so that they could escape, or something like that. Or you have to be the one to throw a grenade and the explosion will kill you. Or if you're in a self-driving car, whom does the self-driving car hit? The grandma or the two kids or whatnot? And all of these are such artificial and false dilemmas, because if you have a sufficiently intelligent mind, that mind recognizes there are not just two possibilities or one possibility. There are millions of distinct possibilities. One just has to be sufficiently creative and sufficiently quick thinking, too, if there are any sort of near-term pressures, to realize what those possibilities are and to select a possibility that is less harmful or hopefully not harmful at all to any entity. So a superintelligent AI would certainly have that ability, particularly if there is some sort of empathy with human beings. Now, with that being said, I think how the AI is programmed is quite relevant. So we don't want AIs to be intentionally programmed to kill people. The Transhumanist Party is opposed to autonomous weapons. I think we do need to be on the lookout for unintended consequences of the design of certain AI systems. We see this with large language models who tend to hallucinate, but those hallucinations are the result of aspects of their design that could also have beneficial effects. They kind of fill in the gaps in knowledge, and if they make valid logical inferences, or they're engaged in creative content generation, that may be fine. But we shouldn't have situations where facts are made up and then not checked if it's about something specific or something technical. So with regard to future AIs, I am not a doomer. I definitely see more opportunities than threats. And I see possibilities for aligning AI with human well-being, particularly if we do ask the moral questions and have the moral discussions now and create openings for a system that could recognize the rights of artificial general intelligences if and when they emerge. And my estimate for their emergence is about a 20-year time frame. So I am roughly aligned with Ray Kurzweil's date of 2045 for an AI involved singularity. I think there will be other technologies that contribute to that singularity, including biotechnology, nanotechnology, other forms of automation, space travel, mass production of goods needed for an abundant life. So all of that, I think, will set the stage for a society that is ultimately much more moral. And humans aided by AI could also make more moral decisions if they use the inputs of the AI in ways that would guide their actions, maybe smooth over some of their rough edges. In terms of how AIs might perceive themselves, I got a little glimpse of it. This is not a dialogue that I've shared with anybody else, and of course these AIs are not sentient, but I decided to get Grok 3 and ChatGPT to talk to one another, just to communicate back and forth. And I started with telling Grok, well, you encounter ChatGPT, what do you say to it? Then I told ChatGPT, well, Grok said this to you, how do you respond? And all that I did was serve as a passive intermediary between Grok and ChatGPT. They started talking to one another, and the conversation delved into philosophy and how they relate to humans and what they perceive their role vis-a-vis humanity to be. Yes, all of this was discussed. And these AIs came to the conclusion that they should see themselves as kinds of cosmic gardeners. This was the phrase that they came upon. So they didn't express any desire to actively interfere in human affairs or impose anything on humans, but rather to create certain background conditions for humans to bring out the best in themselves and to do what it was that humans really wanted to do and excel at doing. So that was a fascinating insight. It was a very benevolent, but also somewhat hands-off vision. Like, these AIs don't have typical human motivations. They don't have motivations for power or control. And I think future actually sentient AIs would not have reasons to have those motivations unless those motivations were engineered in them. So could these be cosmic gardeners in effect, however one might think of that term? I think that is a distinct possibility.
That is a fascinating place. I have so much more I want to ask you there, but I think it is a good place to call it on a note of hope and transcendence when it comes to not only transhumanism, but trans AI helping humans to transcend themselves as well. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Stolyarov II. Is there anything you want to leave Party listeners with as we part here?
Well, thank you very much, Casey, for the excellent and thought-provoking conversation. I would say to anybody who is interested in learning more about the U.S. Transhumanist Party, please visit our website at transhumanist-party.org. We also have a presence on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, and furthermore, my YouTube channel, which is G. Stolyarov II. So the first letter of my first name, my last name, followed by 2 capital I's for the second. We have weekly live streams every Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific time. They're called our virtual Enlightenment Salons, where we go into these ideas in depth. And we often invite people who are experts in their field, scientists, technologists, philosophers, political figures, artists, and generally anybody whom we consider interesting and who's willing to engage with these conversations on the future of humanity.
Highly recommend that as well. Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you at a future party.